The Cult Awareness Network, or CAN, was founded 2 decades ago in the wake of the murders and mass suicides in Guyana that claimed the lives of 850 of the late Jim Jones followers. The concept was simple enough. Set up a non-profit national organization to assist the desperate loved ones of people caught up in the ever-proliferating cult scene. The group known as CAN endures today, but a quarter-century later, none of the people who began the Los Angeles chapter, or anyone who helped nurture the network, has anything to do with it. That's because whenever people call up CAN's hotline these days, the Church of Scientology answers the phone, and instead of warning people about suspected cults, opponents say, the new group promotes them. As one Scientology critic puts it, it's like Operation Rescue taking over Planned Parenthood. The story of how the controversial LA-based church, which Time magazine once termed the cult of greed, commandeered the anti-cult group that was its nemesis, is as bizarre as some of the late church founder L. Ron Hubbard's science fiction. It is also a cautionary tale for anyone who goes up against Scientology, with its penchant for harassing enemies in the courts and its reputation for retaliation against suppressives, those deemed as having ridiculed Scientology's teachings. Those teachings include Hubbard's decree that humans are made up of clusters of spirits called thetans, who were banished to the earth 75 million years ago by an evil galactic ruler named Xenu. L. Ron Hubbard was a pulp fiction writer who served a troubled stint in the Navy and hit it big in 1950 by coming up with the concept of Dianetics, which he dubbed a modern science of mental health. It remains at the core of Scientology practice. One of its staples is a simplified lie detector called an e-meter, which is supposed to measure electrical changes in the skin while subjects discuss the intimate details of their lives. L. Ron Hubbard claimed that unhappiness sprang from mental aberrations called engrams, and that counseling sessions with the e-meter could help rid them of these engrams. Scientologists refer to the extensive and very expensive process of clearing the mind in order for this to occur as auditing. But during the 1970s, the IRS did some audits of its own and accused Hubbard of skimming millions of dollars from the church, laundering it through dummy corporations, and stashing it in Swiss bank accounts. And although he died before the case was adjudicated, his wife and 10 other former church leaders went to prison in the early 1980s for infiltrating, burglarizing, and wiretapping dozens of private and government agencies in an attempt to block their investigations. An organized blizzard of lawsuits, topped off by a lawsuit brought on behalf of a young man named Jason Scott, produced judgments totaling $5.2 million and brought down the anti-cult group into financial ruin. In 1996, the Cult Awareness Network's logo, furniture, and phone number were auctioned off at the order of a bankruptcy judge, and a Scientologist appeared out of nowhere to place the winning bid. But the ultimate indignity for the anti-cult crusaders occurred earlier in a Chicago courtroom. Having already vanquished, the Cult Awareness Network appropriated its name and moved from its offices from Illinois to within blocks of Scientology headquarters in Hollywood. Lawyers with ties to the church moved to take possession of 20 years' worth of the Cult Awareness Network's highly sensitive case files. Filling more than 150 boxes, the materials contained names, addresses, and detailed information on thousands of people who had turned to the Cult Awareness Network for help in rescuing their friends and relatives. The list of organizations targeted by the old Cult Awareness Network read like a who's who of fringe culture. Among them, the KKK, the Aryan Nations, dozens of obscure fundamentalist and evangelical Christian groups, the Church of Satan, the Unification Church of the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, followers of political extremist Lyndon LaRouche, and of course, the Church of Scientology. The Franklin conspiracy refers to a sexual blackmail operation and savings and loan fraud that began in Omaha, Nebraska in the early 1980s. Larry King, a 300-pound pedophile, operated a national child prostitution network that catered to wealthy patrons and Republican Party insiders. King was one of the fastest rising stars in the Republican Party. He sang the national anthem at the Republican Convention in 1984 and 1988. King and his associates defrauded Franklin's Savings and Loan of $40 million and used the residents of Boys Town and other children to videotape powerful and influential men and women engaged in sex acts with minors. These blackmail operations took place during fundraising parties for the Republican Party. Those involved stayed late for the after party that included drugs and sex with minors. The strategy of early MKUltra was to use sexual blackmail operations that targeted political figures in order to ensure continued funding from legislators. Victims who came forward testified that King and his associates performed satanic rituals and human sacrifices. Many of the children who came forward with their stories have since been murdered or imprisoned. The most prominent and vocal victim has been held in solitary confinement longer than any other person in Nebraska history. Larry King served 2 years for fraud and was promptly employed by his good friend, the editor of an Omaha newspaper.
Last night on Lateline, we heard from Scarlett Hanna, the daughter of the president of the Church of Scientology in Australia. She described Scientology as a toxic organisation and was particularly scathing about the treatment of children. Well, tonight a special Lateline investigation raises allegations that the church in Sydney was involved in covering up the sexual assault of an 11-year-old girl. Carmen Rayner alleges that one of the church's most senior figures internationally was involved in coaching her and her mother, both members of the Church of Scientology, to lie to police and community services. Steve Canane reports.
When I was 11 years old, I was with my friend Marinda down at the park, and we're on the merry-go-round, and we just happened to be talking, and I told her that I had someone that touched me, and she said, "That's not right."
And I remember at the time understanding it was such a big thing that she was telling me and how damaging this was for her. And I asked her if I could tell my mother.
Between the age of about 7 to 11, he was molesting me.
I suppose why I was really worried...
Marinda Voigt's mother Louise is the CEO of Bernardo's. At the time she was working in child protection.
Carmen came to see me. I'm brought by my daughter. She gave me a fairly full disclosure of sexual interference by her stepfather, which has been repeated over a considerable number of occasions. I said to her that I really needed to talk to her mum, and that probably we would have to go to the Department of Community Services, as it was then, YACS.
I went into shock. I didn't know how to react. I didn't know what to do, and my first thought was, well, I need to speak to somebody that will help me, and my first thought was the chaplain in Scientology.
Phoebe Rayner brought her daughter here, to the Church of Scientology in Sydney, a response that set off alarm bells for Louise Voigt.
I phoned the Department of Community Services because I was so concerned, because Carmen's mum said that she wouldn't go anywhere, she wouldn't seek any help, she would go to her church, and she then told me it was the Church of Scientology.
And what was your reaction to that?
I was horrified, because I'd been a social worker at the Mental Health Association when it was targeted by the Church of Scientology.
Louise Voigt's concern was justified.
They told me that it was my fault because I'd been bad in a past life. I'd probably done something bad in a past life, so I pulled it in.
How did that feel as a girl who was a victim of abuse to be told that it was your fault from a past life?
I believed them. As a child, I believed them.